Hello, welcome to the session Support Based on Student Needs, Not Student Labels. This is the session description. Please pause the recording and take a minute to read over the session description. My name is Valerie Chapman Jones. I'm a staff developer with the Lincoln Intermediate Unit. Feel free to look at my identity map to learn a little bit about me. I am a TAC or trainer consultant under the Student Services Department. The pillars that I work under include low incidence, LEEI, and community partnerships. My contact information is there in case you'd like to reach out to me after the training. We have one outcome for this session. Participants will practice applying individual learner characteristics as the primary basis for instructional programming and decision making, rather than disability category or educational placement. There are 13 federally recognized disability categories. They are as follows: specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, autism, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, multiple disabilities, traumatic brain injury, hearing impairment, deafness, visual impairment, including blindness, deaf blindness, orthopedic impairment, and other health impairment. There are different types of special education supports that are offered in Pennsylvania, or placements. You might hear that term being used. These are learning support, life skills support, blind and visually impaired support, deaf and hard of hearing support, speech and language support, physical support, autistic support, multiple disability support, emotional support. When looking at the types of special education supports and the 13 disabilities categories, you will notice there is not a one-on-one correspondence. Each disability category does not have its own type of special education support. Rather, multiple disability categories may receive special education services under the different categories of support. That's strictly going to be based on what the team found in the evaluation report or reevaluation report and is chosen based on what the student's needs are. It is not based on their disability category. For example, just because a student has the label of autism does not automatically mean they need autistic support services. It will depend on what autistic support services are offered or look like in that district. The student may need a different kind of support, such as itinerant learning support to meet some needs, and not necessarily need to be in an autistic support classroom. And that applies for all of the different disability categories and the types of support. Now, we can look at these disability categories and they are labels. We can look at the types of special education supports. They are also labels. Special education is full of labels, and they do have a role. One, they're required, they're legally required to have a label for school-based services eligibility to provide them what they need. A lot of people don't like labels, or why do we have to label a student? You hear this from parents. Why do we have to label my kid? It's legally required to get the services they're eligible for and the services they need in the school setting. It can be helpful for setting useful expectations and developing meaningful goals. However, It should not be the only factor we consider when it comes to setting our expectations and developing goals for students. Labels can also be beneficial beyond the school setting. Yes, we need an educational label in order for them to receive school-based services. But there are other services outside of the school setting that having that label is beneficial. For example, thinking of our transition age students who are aging out of school age programs, those labels are required to receive supports beyond the school setting. So, possibly to get into some day programs or other special support services, they're required for those students. For students to receive outside services, such as behavioral services or some private services, they may need a label in order to get those. Another role of label is the focus for disability and self-advocacy. You may have heard a lot about neurodivergence and individuals who are autistic who identify that as they don't want to be called a person with autism. They want to be called autistic because that's who they are. And that's part of their self-advocacy is they're advocating for themselves as an autistic individual. So some individuals with disabilities like to use their label as part of their self-advocacy. And that's a personal choice. There is maybe some good or some bad, but this is what it is found is that having a label can lead to more empathy for others. So, for example, if somebody sees an individual with autism or an autistic individual, I'm going to use both person first and identity first language. They may get empathy from others. The autistic child may be engaging in some behaviors in a public setting and gaining some attention or some confused looks. And, if a concerned parent says, oh, well, my child's autistic, that may give a degree of understanding or empathy, saying, oh, they're just not a bad kid who's engaging in these behaviors. Rather, oh, there's some understanding, some empathy that, okay, your child has autism. That explains some of these behaviors we're seeing in these settings. Researchers do need labels if we want to increase research for students with disabilities, but in order to choose appropriate participants in studies and populations to examine through research, we need to know what their label is. And those are some resources where that information came from. There are concerns with label usage, and that's kind of the point of this presentation. One, is that it may lead to stigma and stereotypes and negative or low expectations, or just plain incorrect assumptions like, oh, well, this kid is intellectually disabled, so I have very low expectations because I know they have a cognitive impairment. Oh, well, those kids with the emotional disturbance, oh, well, they're just bad kids. And, some of those stereotypes and those incorrect assumptions about those kids when we hear the label and we automatically have some preconceived notions about what that student is going to be like. It may harm some students' self-concept. Now we talked about how, some students the autistic is part of their label is part of their identity, but for other students they make feel low self-esteem. Oh, I have a learning disability. I'm dumb. I'm not smart because I have a learning disability. For some kids, it may make them feel worse about themselves. We need to use caution and not define a student based on their disability. Rather, we need to look at them as a whole person. They are more than just a disability. They are a whole unique individual human being. And when we make decisions based on those labels instead of their needs, we're ignoring who they are as a person and focusing on their disability. And the reality is, students can be treated differently based on their disability. Students may, And not even necessarily consciously, teachers and paraprofessionals and parents may and other students may treat that student differently. Oh, well, I know they have disability, so I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And those things may not be appropriate because, again, we need to think about the individual student and not just that global label because all students are different. So we do need to think about the role of labels and school supports. School teams, which can include teachers and support staff, such as paraprofessionals and PCAs like yourselves, and administrators are all part of that. They need to be aware of how that student label impacts them. Because again, some students may be very confident in their label and are comfortable with the label. Other students may feel, it may hurt their self-esteem. And we also need to recognize in ourselves what conscious or unconscious beliefs we have related to that label. So we see a student in a wheelchair with in the multiple disabilities support classroom with a multiple disabilities label, and we may have some unconscious beliefs that we don't even realize. Oh, I'm automatically lowering my expectations for that student, and you might not intentionally be doing that. Or, oh, I automatically reduce a type of vocabulary words I use and talk to them in simpler language and talk to them like a younger child based on that label and not necessarily realizing that we're doing that. It may certainly be unintentional. I really like this quote from David Bateman. Labels do not dictate our services. Diagnosis does not direct what we do. So, whichever one of those disability categories the student is in, whichever support classroom that that student is assigned to in special education, does not dictate the student services. Oh, well, they're in autism support, so they need this, this, and this. They're in life skill support, they need this, this, and this. Oh, that student has an emotional disturbance, they need this, this, and this. The services are not dictated by that label, and we're going to reiterate that point and talk about that through the remainder of this presentation. So, this session is for paraprofessionals. Let's talk about paraprofessional support. You may have one or of these two roles in your school setting. You may be instructional, and that could be a whole class support. You may be assigned to a learning support classroom, an autism support classroom, a life skills support classroom, for example. Or you may provide some individual student support. It may vary. If you're an instructional paraprofessional, you may be doing small group, whole group, some individual students. It's going to look different. It might be in the general education classroom. It might be in the special education classroom. It might be outside of those settings, like in the cafeteria or at the playground. A PCA or a personal care assistant is specifically assigned to an individual student, and they exclusively are providing that individual student the supports they need. Regardless of if you're an instructional paraprofessional or a personal care assistant or PCA, the goal is the same: to fade our support and move that student as close to independence as possible. We are always fading our support is our goal. We are always moving towards independence because once that student is out of the public school system, we're not going to be with them. So we need to always, even as young as kindergarten, we need to be preparing these students for independence and for life after high school to be as independent as possible. So, determining the need for one-on-one support. So, okay, when does a kid need individualized support? When does a student need a PCA? PDE, the Pennsylvania Department of Education, gives some factors that have to be considered by the IEP team when making that determination. Feel free to pause your video right now so you can take a few minutes to read over these 5 factors. One thing you may want to consider when looking at these 5 factors are going back and rereading them. Do you see a disability category name anywhere in these five factors? No, no, you do not. So, a disability category or label is not going to determine whether or not a student needs a one-on-one support or a PCA. In looking at these five factors, do you see any placement names included? Feel free to pause the video if you need to reread. No. Just like there are no disability categories, there are no placement names. It doesn't say, oh, well, the students in autistic support or the students in multiple disability support, that's going to determine if they need one-on-one support, but it's not. It is strictly based on need. And that carries over to our instructional decisions and what supports we're offering. It's not based on disability category. It is not based on placement. It's strictly tied into that individual student's needs, whether or not they need one-on-one support. Who decides when para support is needed? Well, the Pennsylvania Department of Education says that none of the decisions for whom para support, meaning what students they're supporting, how much support, and what type of support they provide, and when that support is needed should be based on disability or label or special education placement. That comes directly from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. We cannot make decisions about what students need support, what that support looks like, and when it's offered strictly based on their label or strictly based on their classroom placement. So if we're not basing those supports on label or on classroom placement, how are we making those decisions? Well, those decisions are made by the IEP team. The individualized paraprofessional support assignment with utilization decisions is based on student needs, not disability category. Regardless of the placement, learning support, emotional support, speech and language support, vision support, the student's IEP dictates what that paraprofessional support is and also that plan for fading. Because again, our goal is always independence. So it is not based on their assignment. It is not based on their category. It is based on that individual IEP, and those decisions are made by the IEP team. It is not made by the disability category or the classroom assignment. The role of the IEP is very important. The IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. And as you can see, the word individualized is in bold because that's the key. The individual drives what's in the IEP. Each kid in the same placement or with the same disability category should not have the same IEP. The IEP is going to include the student's present levels of educational performance, which is going to be different from student to student, and what support the student's needs. And the key is these are unique needs based on that individual student. It is not based on their disability category. It is not based on their placement. It is based on what that student needs. Those unique needs are going to drive the specially designed instruction that the student needs, which you, as a paraprofessional or PCA, may be helping to implement. What is specially designed instruction? You may hear it called by the abbreviation SDI, because in special ed, we use a lot of abbreviations. Those are strategies that help the students meet their unique needs. So again, they're going to differ from student to student, and they help them achieve their IEP goals. They can fall in a couple different areas. They may be strategies related to the content presented, the methodologies used with the student, and what delivery of instruction looks like. And they're going to vary from student to student. So you may have two students in the same life skills classroom with very different specially designed instruction because it's individualized based on their unique needs. SDI can be provided by general education teachers when that student's in their classroom. So, for example, if the student has a learning support IEP and they go out for things like reading and written expression, but are in the general education classroom for math, the math teacher is able to provide that student special design instruction that's applicable in that classroom setting. And regardless, the specially designed instruction has to ensure that access to the general education curriculum because that is what we want for all students. That what strategies can we put in place to help them access the general ed curriculum? A little bit more about specially designed instruction. Who designs it? The special education teacher, the general education teachers that the student works with, and related service providers, which could be speech, PT, OT, deaf, hard of hearing, blind, visually impaired. All of those folks who are on the IEP team are going to design that specially designed instruction, that SDI. And again, for the millionth time, but it's important, so we need to reiterate, it's tied to the individual student's needs. It is not based on classroom assignment. It is not based on disability category. And which goes with it is from student to student, even those in the same place of a disability category, their SDI is going to look different. So two students in autism support should not have identical SDI because it's based on their individual needs. Even though they have the same label of autism and the same placement of autistic support, does not mean they have the same SDI. What is your role as a paraprofessional or PCI or a PCA when it comes to SDI? You're going to support the provision and implementation of those SDI, specifically under the supervision of the student's case manager. So whomever is in charge of their IEP, likely a special education teacher, but it could also be a related service provider. But they're going to help you with this, but it's under what their direction as to how you're going to implement those SDI. They're making those instructional decisions. As a paraprofessional, it's really helpful for you to be able to learn strategies and those SDI by observing the students and seeing the teacher modeling. You see the teacher presenting the lesson. You see the teacher working with the students during independent work or center time. You see the students the staff de-escalating students and talking through things. You can learn those strategies, those SDI, by observing in those moments. You also can reteach or reinforce those strategies. So you're not doing the initial teaching, rather, you're reinforcing what the teacher is already teaching. Or you might be reteaching some of those strategies so that they learn how to do those skills independently. We talked a lot about we do not make these instructional decisions based on students' disabilities. Let's look at some examples of support based on student disabilities. So these are non-examples. These are what not should be occurring and what should not happen. He's autistic. He needs a paraprofessional to follow him around school and make sure he's safe. That's specifically based on his disability category of autism. Another non-example. She has a learning disability in writing. She needs a paraprofessional to scribe for her. Again, that's based on the fact that she's a learning disability in writing. It is not tied into her needs. It's strictly tied to her disability. Then she automatically needs a para to scribe for her. But that simply is not true. Let's rethink these a little bit. What do they look like? What do supports look like based on the individual student's needs? We're taking the disability category out of it. We're looking at those individual unique needs, regardless of classroom placement, regardless of disability category. So think back to that first one. And this is it reworded based on needs. He wanders off or gets lost walking from homeroom to his special education classroom. He needs a paraprofessional to shadow him to make sure he arrives at his destination. It does not say what his special education placement is. It does not say his disability category. It simply looks at what does he need and why does he need it. The second example, she is unable to keep up with the writing demands in the classroom. She has excellent ideas, but shuts down when asked to write anything. Her handwriting legibility is poor, struggles with endurance for writing, and is in the early stages of learning to keyboard. She needs a paraprofessional to scribe responses longer than one sentence in length. So, all of these, again, no mention of disability, but her needs. Here's what she's good at, here's what she needs help with and struggles with. It's her unique profile, her unique needs. And that's what support based on needs might look like. Sometimes you might see blanket supports not tied into disability category, but tied into their classroom placement. And again, as I said for the disability examples, these are actually non-examples. This is not what should be occurring. This is not how we're making instructional decisions. She's in life skills. She needs a paraprofessional attending all specials with her. So it's specific to her placement. She's assigned to a life skills support classroom. So automatically she needs a paraprofessional with her at all specials. And you may have heard statements like these. The non-examples I give you are based on things that you may very likely may see or hear in the school setting. He's in emotional support. He needs a paraprofessional to sit next to him to make sure he's using his strategies. Again, that's specifically based on his placement in an emotional support classroom. And it's tying the type of support that the paraprofessional you are providing based on placement. And that's not what your support should be based on. Your support is not based on their disability category, nor is the type of support you're providing based on their special education placement. So let's take that one and revamp it just like we did with the last one. What do those supports look like when they're based on needs, not placement? And here's the first one. She needs, so remember, it was about life skills. She's in life skills, so she automatically needs a para. And we want to reword that. We may need to rethink how we're talking about things and base it on her needs. So let's reread this. She needs more time to process directions and to begin projects in art class and struggles with setting up and the manipulation of materials to complete her art projects. She needs a paraprofessional to offer assistance with initiation of tasks and use of materials to complete task projects. Again, and use of materials to complete class projects. Nowhere does it say her placement or disability category. And please note, it specifically says art class. So this student may need paraprofessional support in art class for all the reasons listed. But that does not mean she needs paraprofessional support in other special subject areas. The second example was our student who was in an emotional support placement. Let's read supports based on need. When he is in regular education classrooms, he becomes overwhelmed by the noises, the number of people, and the expectations and forgets to use coping strategies he has mastered. He needs a paraprofessional to check in with him when he's starting to show signs of frustration before behaviors of concern start and to remind him of the strategies he can use. So it talks about placement in terms of just in general education, but it does not talk about his disability category or his special education classroom placement. Rather, it's tying in his individual unique needs to what paraprofessional support he needs when in the regular education classroom. These are the citations used in this presentation. I hope this information helps you understand the differences between need-based support and disability or placement-based supports, which we should not be using. So we have some generative questions here at the end that can lead you to some discussion and some self-reflection on the information presented. First, considering the students you support, what are the students' strengths and how can these be used to support increased independence? Number two, considering the students you support again, how can I adjust my support daily based on what the student needs in the moment of the learning environment rather than based on their disability? Thank you for attending this presentation.